The primary function of the respiratory system is gas exchange with the external environment. So the main reason why we need to breathe is so we can bring oxygen into our body and get carbon dioxide out of our body. So why do we need to breathe? Cells do something called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is how the cells in our body are able to make energy in the form of ATP. So without oxygen, we would still be able to make a little bit of ATP, but it wouldn't be enough to keep us alive. So we need to eat so we can get nutrients like glucose and lipids and proteins. We need to inhale so we can get oxygen into our body. And then during the production of ATP, carbon dioxide is made as a byproduct. And we need some carbon dioxide in our blood, but we can't have too much in our body fluids. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later. So first of all, let's take a look at the main structures associated with the respiratory system. We have the nose, the pharynx, which is also kind of considered the throat, the larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea, also known as the windpipe, and then bronchi, bronchioles, and then alveoli in the lungs. Inside the nasal cavity, we have these bony protrusions called conchi. And back when we learned about the bones of the skull, we looked at the nasal conchi. So there were the superior nasal conchi, the middle nasal conchi, and the inferior nasal conchi. And these bony protrusions, you could see them when we looked inside the nasal cavity of the skull. And these bony protrusions are covered in epithelial tissue, which makes up a mucous membrane. And the mucus that's produced by this mucous membrane helps to trap debris when you inhale. So think about things like dust, bacteria, pollen, all that stuff gets stuck in the mucus that is being secreted by the mucous membrane of the epithelial tissue on the nasal conchi. And the nasal conchi help to increase surface area so that there's more contact between the air and the mucous membrane. That mucus also helps to humidify incoming air. That means it adds moisture to the air, and that just helps, it makes it easier for the air to not dry out the structures kind of further down in the pathway. In addition to mucus trapping debris, there's also cilia. Cilia are little cellular extensions that help to sweep mucus away from the lungs. So you can kind of think of them as like little brooms that help to sweep the mucus covered in the mucus with trapped debris. It helps to sweep it away from the lungs so you can either cough it out or swallow it in order to let the stomach acid kind of break down the stuff that gets trapped there. Your nose also has a lot of blood vessels, and if you've ever had a bloody nose, you know how much your nose can bleed. Well, blood vessels help to bring heat or warmth to the area. So that also helps to warm up air as you're inhaling. This is especially important when it's really cold out because cold air entering the lungs can be kind of a shock to the system. The nasal cavity is separated from the oral cavity by a structure called the palate. The anterior part of the palate is made up of bone, and it's called the hard palate. And the posterior part of the palate is made up of muscle tissue, and it's called the soft palate. And if you run your tongue along the roof of your mouth, you can kind of feel where the palate goes from being hard to where it goes to being kind of soft and flexible. Now, the oral cavity and the nasal cavity are connected to each other back here in the pharynx. And so this is one reason why if you take a drink of water or something and someone makes you laugh, that water can come up and out of your nose because the two cavities are connected. Now, this structure here is called the pharynx. It's more commonly referred to as the throat, and it's actually made up of three different regions. There's the nasopharynx, which is the area at the posterior part of the nose. There's the oropharynx, which is the area posterior to the oral cavity. And then the laryngopharynx is the part of the pharynx that leads into the larynx, and the larynx is also known as the voice box. So the larynx is primarily made up of cartilage, and if we take a look at this, if you recall when we were learning the skeletal system structures, we learned about the hyoid bone, which is kind of in the throat region, and here's where it is here as well. So the hyoid bone is kind of up at the superior opening of the larynx. And the larynx itself is made out of a couple different types of cartilage. Some kind of main ones to know are the thyroid cartilage here. And the thyroid cartilage you can actually palpate from the external body surface through the skin because it's also called the Adam's apple. So this laryngeal prominence is called the Adam's apple. And in males, this is more pronounced than it is in females. Another really important flap of cartilage is called the epiglottis, and you can kind of see it up here. And this epiglottis is what prevents you from choking when it works properly. So I'm going to go back a slide real quick and show you how you've got the trachea here, and you've got the esophagus here. And the esophagus goes to the stomach, whereas the trachea goes to the lungs. So when you swallow, the swallowing action closes the epiglottis to close off the trachea so that food and drink goes down the esophagus to the stomach instead of going down the trachea to the lungs. So this hopefully prevents you from choking on eating and drinking. Inside the larynx, we also have the vocal cords. The vocal cords are the cords that are involved in allowing you to speak and make noises. So this is a picture of someone using an endoscope to look down someone's pharynx and then into their larynx. And these two bands right here are called the vocal cords. And so they can open and close. And as air passes across them, they vibrate. And it's the vibrations that produce the sounds that you can then hear. So these are the vocal cords here, deep down in the larynx. And I believe that this is the epiglottis up here. So it's open right now. But when you swallow, this flap of cartilage would close over the opening here to prevent food and drinks from going into your lungs. The trachea is inferior to the larynx, and it's also known as the windpipe. And as we mentioned, it is also anterior to the esophagus, so the esophagus runs behind it. The trachea is made up of several rings of cartilage, and these rings are C-shaped, so they're actually not connected in the back. And that's because the back of the trachea is made up of muscle and elastic connective tissue. And that's so when you're swallowing, the esophagus can actually push a little bit into the lumen or the opening of the trachea in order to kind of expand a little bit. So that flexible membrane on the posterior part of the windpipe allows the esophagus to expand when it needs to. Now the trachea branches into smaller and smaller structures that ultimately delivers air to the structures in the lungs. So from the trachea, it branches into the two primary bronchi. So you've got a right primary bronchus and a left primary bronchus. The primary bronchi branch into secondary bronchi, which then branch into tertiary bronchi. So you go from the trachea to primary bronchi to secondary bronchi to tertiary bronchi. And then from there we start to get microscopic and we go into bronchioles and terminal bronchioles, which eventually lead into structures called alveoli. Alveoli are these kind of thin-walled sacs that are found at the end of the bronchioles. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of them and they're microscopic. So we've got a bronchiole here and then a cluster of alveoli around it. So all the other structures, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, Those are just passageways for air to get in and out of the lungs, but gas exchange actually occurs at the alveoli. So this is where we absorb or take in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So the majority of the lungs are made up of these alveoli clusters. And as I mentioned, each sac is microscopic, and the walls of the sac are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So simple means that there's only one layer of cells, and squamous means that those cells are flattened. So it's a very, very thin membrane, and that's really necessary in order for the rapid exchange of gases such as oxygen and carbon dioxide. There are also specialized cells inside the lungs that secrete something called surfactant, and that's because there is fluid in the lungs, and fluid tends to stick to itself. So think about if you've ever had like a plate that maybe you just washed it but you haven't dried it yet, and you put it down on a smooth countertop, and you go to pull it up from the countertop, and the surface tension of the water is kind of holding the plate to the countertop with, it almost feels like suction. So if your lungs don't produce surfactant, then that would happen in the alveoli, and they would actually collapse in on themselves because of the surface tension of the fluid in the alveoli. But thankfully, this surfactant breaks up that surface tension to prevent that from happening. Now, in some babies that are born premature, sometimes they say that the lungs haven't matured yet, and in which case sometimes they have to give an injection in order to kind of stimulate the lungs to secrete surfactant, because if not, the baby won't breathe on its own when it's born.